things, most of you should already have this downloaded. We kind of had it downloaded from last time, right? So at this stage, just kind of a quick reminder, if you just kind of do a search for text tools for Blender, right? So quick search tool, text tools for Blender, what you'll see is it kind of will bring up some links. And I usually like kind of the GitHub one, right? So you just go down to here, click on it. Actually, if I remember correctly, this is not the one I like. Go back one. All right. Actually, I feel like it's usually... Let's see. I kind of feel like maybe it's that one. I'm trying to remember. Actually, it should be here. Just trying to think where we go to get it. There's usually a better link for this. There we go. I'm trying to think where... Because there's an easier way to get this guy. I'm just trying to remember. Text tools for Blender. I don't think it's going to be that one. Let's see here. Come on. Let's see. Text tools. Actually, I think I have a space usually. I think that's why. There we go. There we go, yeah. So if you do text tools, right, with a space, right, T-E-X and then space tools for Blender, I like the releases right here. You can click on that one, right, and then you'll see that that's kind of the latest text tools. You can just scroll down, and what you do is you download the text tools zip, right, so this one right here, the text tools zip. You just click on that to download, right, and it'll download into your download section. So you will want to do a quick bit of a search, right? And it's best to kind of do, like I said, text tools with the space for Blender, right? And then, of course, I usually go down to the releases one, right? Releases on GitHub. Click on that, and then you can kind of just go right here to just download the total zip, right? And that'll give you your actual zip file. You just download that, right? You just click on this, and it'll just download right in your download section. I've already got it downloaded, but whatever. So remember, you used to do a little bit of kind of internet exploring on that, right? If you want to install text tools, right, what you do is you go to Edit, Preferences, right? We've seen Edit Preferences a bunch before. You go to Add-ons, because this is an add-on, but instead of searching for one, you'll notice right up here there's an Install button, right? Click on the Install, and then it takes you to your browser. You can go to Download section, and there you can see his text tools, right? You actually could see I've already got older zips of it, right? So if I wanted to update it, I could update it with this new one, but I don't feel like it's radically changed since last time. I think it's the last one I had installed at home. But anyways, you could just kind of click on that, double-click on it, or install add-on. So that's how easy it is to install add-ons. Is instead of, when you go to add-ons searching for it, you just click on the Install button right up here, right? And then you just go find where you downloaded it, which will probably be in the download section. And you just double-click on it or click on it, install add-on, and it will install it. And then what you can do is just search for text, right? T-E-X. There it is, and you just check it on, right? Check it on. I think if you go to Blender Market, it's like $1 for text tools, but it is, from what I understand, what I've always seen it, it's also free if you just go to kind of that releases GitHub area as well. So this is a free add-on, but it does give you some extra tools for UVunwrapping here, right? Right? It does give you some extra tools. Now, in this case, I'm going to quickly go to UVunwrap the body. So I'm going to click on the body, turn the eyeball on for it, select it, click the eyeball off. Now, like we said, one of the things is if, in particular, you know, and you want to go to UV Editing Workspace, right? So remember, we've been working in Modeling Workspace up to this point, but we want to go to UV Editing, because this is the process of taking a two-dimensional model and turning it, or a three-dimensional model, and turning it into a two-dimensional model, right? You notice how those kind of parts look like the parts of the model, but they've kind of been peeled off and then straightened out and flattened out to be pretty smooth, low wrinkle, what we call low distortion. We skin them, right? Yeah, exactly. So that's what UV editing is about, because textures ultimately end up being 2D images. And so we need to make the model, the 3D model, into something that's a 2D version of itself to go over a picture, right? An actual two-dimensional picture. So UV Editing Workspace, right? And that brings up your UV editor here. And of course, I usually go down to the green triangle down here in the kind of our properties menu. That way you can actually open up the UV Maps section, although I think it's usually open up by default. But if it's not, just click on UV Maps. And you can actually name this UV map, right? You just double left click on it, and you just call this Biped Body, right? There we go. Just like if we go to Biped Gear, you see how it's called Biped Gear? That way there's names, and it makes it easier to kind of point to the right one. So it's good to name your UV maps, right? Now, of course, you want to delete half of this, because even though technically you could do a full asymmetrical set of UVs if you need that, we're just trying to keep it simpler for ourselves, right? Kind of maximize, particularly since you guys are working on your laptop devices, the school provided, right? Those aren't exactly super high end, right? So we're trying to keep it a little simpler for you guys. But in this case, remember, one of the easiest ways to delete half this model is to go to 3 for face mode. And remember, if you double click between the edges, right? So I'm in 3 for face mode. If I double click, kind of like right here on this edge, right? Because remember, if you pick an edge between these two faces, it'll do it that way. If you do one this way, it'll do that way. So remember, it's kind of whichever edge you're closest to, it'll kind of bias that way. Once you understand about face loop selection in Blender, it's awesome, particularly if you're using industry compatible. So I want to select that face loop kind of on one side going all the way through. Because remember, at this point, our modifiers have been applied, so we don't have mirror on anymore. I'll hit delete, right? Faces. In this case, I've assigned a quick key to it, of course, shift delete. And then, of course, remember, you can do select linked. Remember, that is right bracket, right? That is your right bracket. It's kind of right above enter, right below backspace. It looks like a parentheses, but kind of square. Of course, the select menu has select linked as well. I changed it to a quick key I like for it better. I'm not an animator, so I don't use spacebar for going through the animation quick keys. But select linked will select all of the linked polygons to that one you selected. These aren't linked anymore because we deleted that face down the center. That's what linked means. Even if they're one object, there's no more polygons there, so they're not directly touching anymore. And then, of course, delete faces. And we'll get to see this again when I do some review lecture on the body, and I'll do some more review lecture for UVunwrapping this week as well, of course. But, you know, we need our first kind of lecture for it. Now, at this point, it's easier to just kind of set up your UVs first, your edges, right, your seams. So once again, this is just like what we did last time for UVunwrapping, right? There's already a UVunwrapping video for gear, and this time I'm going to do body. So remember, you go to 2 for edge mode, right? Seams are edges, or edge loops. So if I go to 2 for edge mode, I can start to go in here and just select edge loops, or partial loops, right? So I'll kind of double left click there to select that edge loop. I usually kind of select one down here for the ankle, so shift double left click, shift double left click, right? Because remember, shift adds to selections, and double left click will select edge loops. And I need one to go with that kind of the foot, so I shift double left click here through kind of the foot. Now you'll notice that seam kind of looks like the seam that you'd have for your shoes, right? If you actually look at your shoes, there's kind of the sole, right? Kind of on the bottom, that rubber part. That's actually a good guide for where your seam's going to go at, right? So you see how the seam kind of goes through the whole foot there? Now I usually also kind of put three kind of little ones right here between the two just to kind of pop the back open there. But remember, this is just selecting edge loops. So 2 for edge mode, select edge loops. Remember, if you right-click, right-click brings up your context menus, right? In this case, I'm in edge mode, 2 for edge mode, so it's bringing up the edge context menu. You'll see way down here is the mark seam feature. So you notice how UVunwrapping is mechanically a lot easier than modeling. It's a lot faster. It's just kind of boring, right? Modeling can be exciting. Sculpting and painting can be exciting. UVunwrapping is not that exciting. But it does tend to be pretty straightforward and fast to do nowadays, because a lot of packages have good tools for this stuff. Default stock Blender tools are fairly good, but textools adds a few extra tools which are neat. That's why I kind of pointed out where to get those, right? So I'll mark seam, and now you'll see that those are red edges. Those seams have been marked. Remember, for characters, creatures in particular, clothing is a good guide. In this case, I need to kind of have an inseam going up the leg, right? Now, remember, if I select an edge, and then I shift left-click on an edge way up here along the same edge loop, I can go to select linked shortest path, and that will select an edge loop between those. So remember, there is a shortest path feature in Blender, right? But manually, you could technically do this. It just takes longer. So remember, take the time to ask me these questions, watch the videos again if you need to, right? But remember, in the select link menu, for the select menu, there is shortest path. And that basically means you just have to have a start edge and an end edge selected to do it. Technically, they don't have to be on the same edge loop, but it'll just kind of start to kind of create like a jigsaw puzzle selection. And then, of course, right-click, mark seam. But you notice how this is looking a lot like the way we set our seams up for our pants, right? Pants kind of have a waist. They have kind of the bottom of the pants where they kind of end at your shoe. Now, technically, pants have a seam on the outside and the inside, but we don't need both of those, right? So usually we just do the inseam. So remember, when you're looking for seams on characters' creatures, even for gear, look at clothing, right? Look at clothing. That can really help. Give you a good guide for it. So in this case, I'll probably kind of set one up for the neck. So I'll just double left click here, shift double left click there. And we've kind of got a loop going through the neck there. Right click, mark seam. Right, remember, right click brings up your edge context menu, mark seam. Usually your shoulder kind of has a seam right at the shoulder. Technically we could put it through here, but I kind of tend to put it through there. No real right or wrong though. If you put it there, it's not a big deal. Remember, double left click to select an edge loop, shift double left click if you need to add multiple. I can do the same thing down here, shift double left click, shift double left click. And then of course, right click, mark seam. And slowly but surely you see how these seams get marked. I probably would actually kind of put a seam around the ear here as well to pop it off. So I'll double left click, shift double left click, shift up, and you see how sometimes you have to kind of do a couple? Because remember, when you select edge loop hits a 5-star, it stops, right? It kind of follows similar rules to loop cut. The bigger the star you get, that it'll stop, right? Kind of tends to like and work predictably with 4 stars, which are normal. That's kind of what a lot of your models should be made of, right? And of course, I'll do the same thing with the horn. Shift double left click because I'm still adding a bunch, right? Shift double left click. Remember, shift adds to selections. And of course, double left click is for selecting edge loops. And of course, I could right click, mark seams. Now you notice I set these up because, well, they're appendages, right? So you should always have a seam to separate the appendages off other parts, right? There's seams to kind of separate the arms. And I made it seams to kind of separate the ear and the horn, because if this was more of a thin human ear, you wouldn't have to worry about that so much. But it's not, right? It's a couple of extrusions out. It's kind of much more of like a long, kind of elf-like ear, right? So it's kind of more of a true appendage. Now, of course, remember, shortest path can work well, but in this case, sometimes it's a little tricky to kind of do shortest path for the hand. So remember, there's a great one. If I select an edge, and we want to kind of do it along the center one, but you see how you don't want to just double click, right? Don't go, well, I know there's supposed to be a hand seam, I'll just double left click on it, right? That's where if you have a question, ask me. Watch the video, right? Because we don't need this seam to go all the way at the body. That just adds a lot more seams. You want to always try to have fewer seams. That way, if you ever have to do 2D painting, you'll be in good shape. 3D projection painting does quite a good job of not worrying about seams at all, but it's generally good practice to have fewer seams. That way you just don't have to worry about seam issues at all, less, right? And if you ever needed to do 2D painting, that's less seams to worry about, right? So our hand needs to really just be kind of through the hand like this, but it should just go from the wrist to the wrist. Now, shortest path could be used for that, right? So I select an edge there, and then shift left click on an edge further up, select linked shortest path, right? But remember, there's actually an even faster way to do this. If I shift left click and then shift left click on two right next to each other, I can start to do what's called select more or less next active, right? I have assigned a quick key to these because these are super useful. I use these a lot, right? It's one of those things I didn't even actually figure out Blender had initially until I was using it for a little while. Something I loved in Modo, and I'm like, oh, I missed it. You know, but it's there. It's actually there. It's great. So remember, in the select menu, select more or less, because remember, default more and less have up and down there. That's just your ability to grow or shrink your selection. Next active, previous active is kind of like a grow and shrink for edge loops or face loops. Although if you skip, it'll also skip. It's actually really, really cool. That's why I have default quick keys, and I figured it's a lot like more or less, so I just added a quick key shift up arrow, shift down arrow, right? Remember, the way to add a quick key, right click, and in this case I don't have a shortcut, so I'll just kind of do it again, right? Right click, assign shortcut, and just type in shift up arrow. There we go. And watch what happens when I do shift up arrow. It just keeps growing that selection right along that path. So this is super, super cool and super useful, right? It's a bit faster and easier than shortest path sometimes. So you should have an edge loop through there. Now, if you didn't quite do the cleanup like I did on my hand, you might get to a point where you have to kind of just manually select and kind of go back around and do a new one, right? So, but you want something pretty similar to this. Have you ever looked at seams on a glove? Right? Look at gloves and see where the seam's at on gloves. That's where your seam should be at on a hand. Clothing is a great, great guide for where your seams should go at for UVunwrapping for characters, creatures. Clothing. Clothes. So I can right-click, mark seam. And then, of course, I can do the similar thing here. Remember, if you select an edge, now if I skipped an edge, right, so if I select an edge and then I shift left-click an edge, skips it, when I do shift up arrow, you see how it skips it? So this next active, previous active is actually super awesome. It's actually a great selection tool. We want to do it non-skipping. So I select an edge, and then I shift click on it, one right next to it. Then I'll do shift up arrow, and it just grows that selection. Now you notice I'm always making sure that a seam goes to another seam, right? You don't want there to be one missing edge. Then that'll be kind of like a piece of paper being still, you know, having a little bit connected, right? You have to kind of, you don't want that, right? You want to make sure that there is, like, it goes from seam to seam. You don't want there to be one little connecting part there. So right click, mark seam. And then, of course, I like to kind of do a seam for the upper shoulder. That way the front of the chest and the back of the chest separate off. So I can select an edge, shift left click on an edge up right next to it. Remember, select more or less, next active. I'm just going to use my quick key for it, shift up arrow. Remember, it's this tool right here. Select more or less, next active. Right click, mark seam. And now we're just kind of getting ourselves to the point where I probably want to separate the face off a little bit. So I'll just do some more select next active. Probably go to here, then maybe connect that up a little bit there. Right click, mark seam. Should also kind of do a little one for the face. This one should be shortest path. It'll be working well for shortest path. Select link, shortest path. There we go. Right click, mark seam. And that way the face can kind of separate off from the back of the head. Now, because there is an ear here, it's probably a good idea to kind of do at least a little bit of seam to allow it to open up a little bit better, right? So I could always kind of do maybe a little bit of one of back there if I wanted to, or if you really wanted to, you could maybe kind of, you know, do when that grows up here a little bit. right-click, mark seam. That way it can kind of open up a little bit. Same thing with the horn, right? There should always be some kind of seam that goes up the side, right? It can't just be a seam that pops off the body. There has to be like in a bottle, right? There's the top and bottom of the label on the bottle, right? Those kind of create natural seams because there's no more sticker. But then there's the seam down the back that lets you peel it off, right? So once again, select more or less next active. I'm going to just kind of use that default quick key I've got. Right click, mark seam. And now you can see that those are my seams for this character, right? Following pretty closely to what clothes should have, right? Kind of a seam up your shoulder, kind of down your waist. There's also a seam kind of popping off the arm itself and going down there. There's a seam through the hand for like a glove. And this will provide you some good seams. Now at this point I can go to 3 for face mode. And remember, select all. Control A will select all your polygons. And then we can go to the UV menu here in the UV Editing Workspace. Unwrap. Unwrap. Now, just to see what it'll look like with distortion, if you haven't already opened it up, remember there's a little V right here in UV Editor, just like there is for the regular workspaces, right? It's kind of right next to the magnifying glass and the UV workspace here. It's a little V pointing to the left. Click on that to open this up. And you see there's Magic UV if you need those, some image features, tool. But at the very bottom should be text tools. And you see what text tools has is your ability to do a quick checker map preview. Can you do this without text tools? Yes, right? We kind of just plug in a UV grid texture into our color channel for the material. But this makes it a bit easier. So you just open up your text tools, click on the size, because we probably want it to be a little bigger, like 2048. So this has already got some nice presets for you. And then you can click checker map, and it creates a checker map preview for us. And now when we look at this, you see how it's pretty low distortion? You see how the checkerboard looks pretty checkerboard? You've done good UVs if you have a checkerboard look. Can we use some tools like Live UV Unwrap to maybe fix up a little bit of distortion here and there? Yeah. But you'll notice the distortion's pretty minor on this. Everything unwrapped pretty well, right? The default UV unwrapping algorithm in Blender is a fairly good one. And I'm not trying to exhaust every UV unwrapping tool you'll ever use, right? There's plenty in here. Technically, you could turn Live UV Unwrap on and you could pin areas down and move them interactively with your tweak or move tools. It can be neat to fix up areas if you need to, but generally I find you don't have to do that too much, right? The core UV Unwrap does a pretty good job of doing a pretty low distortion UV Unwrap. So if you look at the actual, and you probably want textured on instead of shaded, right? Usually that's on in UV editing though. Remember, there's kind of your wireframe button here. There's your viewport shading button, and then there's kind of one that looks a little bit like this material icon down here. That is texture, right? It's kind of third one of these kind of spheres, these balls up here, right? Spheres. The third one, right here, will show you viewport shading. That shows you your texturing on your model. And you see how that's actually looks pretty checkerboard. So if you can look at every part of your model, all the islands, and they look like a checkerboard image, you're in good shape. Just to kind of show you if you ran into a problem, right, if I was to, like, say, maybe grab these just to kind of really screw it up. But actually, I want to grab. So if I was to start to just really distort it, if that's what your UV, if your distortion grid on there looks like this, those UVs are not good, right? That's distortion, right? It should look like a checkerboard. It doesn't have to be a perfect checkerboard, but it should look like a pretty good checkerboard. And they can be at angles, right? But if that's what you're seeing, that's not good UVs. Those are too distorted, right? It should look like a checkerboard. All right. So that'd be a great place to, I think, stop there, and then we'll just kind of end up you know, kind of when we do sculpting later in the week, we'll do mirroring over to set up sculpting, all that stuff. It'll be a good place to stop.